The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And welcome into Liberty Nation. Tim Donner is off this week. I'm Greg COROMBOS, news director at the Radio America Network and co-host of the Three Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in this week. Coming up this hour, we'll dive into big tech's war against conservatives. Like it or not, conservatives and libertarians pretty much rely on the big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others to get their messages out. But what happens when those outlets stop being champions of free speech and become cheerleaders for what they like and censors for what they don't? James O'Keefe of Project Veritas is on the front lines of this fight. He'll be joining us in just a moment. We'll also talk with former Virginia Congressman Dave Brat, who is now the dean of the business school at Liberty University. Mr. Brat was a key member of the House Freedom Caucus and joins us to discuss the state of that caucus. It's an important question, especially in the wake of the caucus formally voting to rebuke Michigan Congressman Justin Amash for supporting an impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Amash is one of the most libertarian members of the House and subsequently resigned from the Freedom Caucus following that vote. Mr. Brat will also tell us what Republicans need to start doing right now if they want to have any chance of reclaiming the House majority following the 2020 elections. LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza will be with us to examine some important legal battles centering on freedom and fairness. But first, let's talk about our media. It's been another week, no surprise, of bias by omission and commission, but three examples stand out. Let's start with The Hill, one of the key Capitol Hill newspapers. On Wednesday morning, The Hill tweeted out a headline with this shocking title: "Just in, Trump administration to send migrant children to former Japanese internment camp." Horrifying, right? Well, it would be, if it were actually true. The truth is, our border is getting flooded by greater and greater numbers of migrants every month, and detention facilities at the border simply can't handle the load, while all these asylum claims are processed. Of course, the clickbait cons over at The Hill couldn't back up their salacious headline and the actual story. The story itself, pretty factual. Here's how it starts. Some immigrant children detained at the southern border will be sent to a U.S. Army base once used to intern Japanese Americans during World War II, as authorities seek new shelters to house an overflow of people crossing the border. The Health and Human Services Department, which operates the Office of Refugee Resettlement, said it was activating facilities at Fort Sill Army Base near Lawton, Oklahoma, as a temporary emergency shelter for children detained at the border. Well, that's quite a bit different than saying we're sending them to an internment camp, isn't it? But this is still some major departure from the past actions of more respectable administrations, right? Not exactly. The Hill story admits, quote, "The site was also used as a shelter in 2014 under the Obama administration," unquote. And you'll be shocked to know that multiple journalists scoured the archives of major news sites and could not find a single reference to internment camps when Obama sent migrants there during his administration just 5 years ago. Oh, and The Hill admits that lawmakers and even the media will have access to the facilities at Fort Sill. But sure, compare the decision to what a Democrat president did more than 70 years ago to put the constitutional rights of American citizens through the shredder. Hey, but don't worry, the mainstream media isn't biased, and they're not anti-Trump. They're pro-truth. So says, CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta. Acosta has a brand new book out this week that no one should buy. Don Lemon, his CNN colleague, had him on to plug the book, and the following conversation actually took place.
That's right. We're here to hold their feet to the fire. And just because we are pro-truth doesn't mean that we are anti-Trump. And, you know, as I write throughout this book and I try to close it out on a hopeful note, we are not the enemy of the people. We are defenders of the people. And we want to defend the people because we're devoted to the people. You and I, Don, our families, our parents, our kids, our loved ones, we all think about all of those folks when we come into the office and do this job on a daily basis. We're not here to spin things or, color things a certain way. We're here to give the people reliable, accurate information on a daily basis. That's why we all come into work every day.
And the third major story that unfolded this week was the crafty social media site Pinterest labeling the pro-life group Live Action as pornography. When called on it, Pinterest quietly removed Live Action from the porn domain. But when internal documents showed Pinterest knew Live Action was wrongly classified all along, Pinterest banned Live Action altogether, and Project Veritas, which went public with the internal Pinterest documents, had its video on the subject banned on YouTube and its Twitter account suspended. That's what we'll dig into after the break. James O'Keefe of Project Veritas will be with us to explain exactly what happened and why the battle against big tech is much bigger than most people realize. I'm Greg Caucus, sitting in for Tim Donner. Liberty Nation. We'll be right back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Caucus, filling in for Tim Donner. Thanks so much for being with us this week. My guest at this time is James O'Keefe. He's the founder and president of Project Veritas. Over the past several months, O'Keefe and Project Veritas revealed efforts at now 3, maybe going on 4, major social media sites to enhance liberal figures and causes and to crack down on conservatives. The latest example is Pinterest. Earlier this week, the pro-life group Live Action revealed that it was banned from Pinterest and even labeled as pornography. Project Veritas discovered there's even more to this story. And James, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg, for having me.
Well, Live Action and Project Veritas are kindred spirits, to say the least. Both groups have used undercover videos to bring uncomfortable information to light. Live Action now banned on Pinterest, and you learned even more about how Pinterest looks at conservatives in general. What did you find?
This was a big story indeed. Over the last 2 days, a whistleblower, an insider, came to me at Project Veritas and said that there was a behavior. There were documents, and he shared the documents with us, and what he showed was a porn domain blacklist. This is the actual porn domain blacklist is the term of art that Pinterest uses. It's a big tech company where you pin different designs for offices or whatever. And in this porn domain blacklist, it had Live Action, the nation's largest pro-life media organization. And when I went to type in Live Action things on the website, I noticed that it wasn't letting me do it. So the whistleblower, we interviewed him in the shadows. We show the documents, we publish the story, and Pinterest responds by removing Live Action from the porn domain blacklist. And then after we published the video, a few hours later, then they just banned Live Action outright. So Pinterest responds by placing the insider on administratively. They escort him outside the building. YouTube bans our video. Twitter suspends our account. So it's been quite a series of events, Greg. The big tech companies are caught red-handed. They're responding. They're tripping over themselves and creating more news in the process.
What did your whistleblower discover about what was considered troublesome material, at least at Pinterest? We talked about Live Action. Is it a broad swath of conservatism? Is it things that aren't even related to politics? So what did you discover?
Well, the only pro-life website was Live Action, and the reason why we highlighted that website on the porn list, which is 3,000 pages long, every pornographic website you can imagine. But the reason there was a conversation internally on a Slack thread, which is a text messaging internal thread, and the employee at Pinterest actually said in this private messaging board, she said, I've seen Live Action on there, and she basically said it shouldn't be on there, but we're going to keep it on there. So there was that proved that the executives at Pinterest knew that Live Action, the pro-life group, wasn't pornography, but was putting it on the list anyway. And what that meant for the company is that Live Action couldn't post. So Pinterest is a publicly traded $12.7 billion IPO. they're concerned about this news affecting them. And it appears to be the case, Greg, that Pinterest put pressure on YouTube corporate to remove our video. Now, other websites were on that porn list, including a website Zero Hedge, which is a conservative economics website. PJ Media is a conservative website. So the pattern seemed to be conservative websites and Live Action, the pro-life website, were targeted.
From what we've seen in a lot of cases so far, James, when a conservative gets banned or suspended from a particular site, it's oftentimes just that site. But in this case, there's very close coordination here because, as you mentioned, once Live Action was banned from Pinterest and then you reported on it, YouTube and Twitter dropped the sledgehammer pretty quickly here. So what does it tell you about coordination, if anything?
Well, it tells, the insider, we interviewed him, and he went on the Tucker Carlson show last night on Fox, and what he said to me was, this is the watershed moment. This is the event horizon. This is the moment that we've passed where now things are going to start snowballing. And I think it's he thinks he's motivated by the pro-life cause. That's why he came forward. And he said because of Roe versus Wade, of where things stand in that court case, the big tech companies have drawn a line in the sand, and they're going to start choosing to be have an editorial agenda. And they're no longer just big tech companies who have platforms; they're publishers. And now they're trying to stop and censor and prohibit the American people from having the information that'll wake them up, that'll shake them awake, said the insider to me. So it's been pretty extraordinary. YouTube banned my video. Of course, I don't have anywhere to go. YouTube and Twitter and Facebook are the platforms I use. So Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, embedded our YouTube video in his tweet, which garnered a few 100,000 views. So it's a lose-lose situation for the big tech companies, because if they censor the truth, then it's obvious what they're doing. So that's why this is a watershed moment, and the insider wants 12 more people like him to come forward, which I guarantee you is probably what's going to happen.
The dilemma, of course, as you'll hear in the argument, and you've probably heard it a million times already, is that on the one hand, these social media companies can make whatever rules of engagement they want. They're not the government, so it's not like they're clamping down on your First Amendment rights officially, as if the government were doing it. But at the same time, they claim to be a platform for free speech. And the way that social media plays such a huge role in our national discourse now, that essentially trying to silence one side really changes the way that important things are discussed in this country. So how do you encourage folks to think about this as this watershed moment unfolds?
Well, I think it's like the corporate malfeasance cases of the 1990s with the whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand in 60 Minutes, right? That was a private corporation, but private corporations are not allowed to lie to their customers. And these companies, I think, have exemptions. Section 230 is something that many people want to remove from Facebook so that they are considered to be news organizations, or they don't have that exception that protects them. But I think the way to think about this is that if you want to ban content for political reasons, to help elect certain political candidates or appoint certain judges, then you need to come out and say that. Historically, the media has more power than all three branches of government. They call it the fourth estate for a reason, that we live in a democratic republic where citizens have to make informed decisions about who they're voting for, and they get their information from a supposedly free press. Well, the private press, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, disseminates their content through Google, Pinterest, Facebook, and Twitter. If those tech companies adjust their algorithms and tinker with how they distribute information, then we're getting information through that prism. We don't get it directly from CNN. Only 600,000 people watch that network. But vis-a-vis the social media companies is how we are distributed that information. So in that regard, the big tech companies have more power than all three branches of government. Therefore, it's incumbent upon journalists or citizen journalists to do the job themselves. We have to do the job ourselves because we can't entrust the fourth estate to take Google on. The whistleblower did not go to the New York Times, Greg. He came to Project Veritas because, in his words, he feared the New York Times or Washington Post selling him out, not doing service to the insider. So that's a pretty extraordinary statement about the state of journalism and the state of play, and I believe that there are going to be 12 more people blow the whistle like him, and I think that is what is going to happen next.
You've got an interesting political collaboration of people who are not happy with what's happening with social media. Elizabeth Warren wants government involvement. You've got some folks on the right who think that the Fed should step in to make sure that it is, in fact, a level playing field. You're a free market guy. Well, what should the government's role be here?
I think that I am a free market, maybe in a sense. I'm a libertarian in a sense, and I believe that the most important thing is for the American people to have the truth. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not a congressman. I don't have the solutions to the problem, but what I do believe is that if people know what is going on and these companies are transparent about what they're doing, I just want them to be transparent. Because if they tell the truth, listen, we have a political agenda. We want to help elect Democrats, and we want to have judges that are pro-Roe v. Wade, and we're going to censor content accordingly, and that's their MO, their modus operandi. My objective is I want them to say that transparently, honestly, and candidly. What they shouldn't do is perjure themselves under oath in front of Congress. That's very bad. There are laws against perjury, and my objective is for the big tech companies to speak clearly and tell their users what their agenda is. And I think if they do that, Greg, everything will work itself out. I think we'll all come up with the right public policy solutions, but no public policy solutions can happen until Google, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, Reddit, and others are honest about what they are doing.
Last question for you, James. All of this is happening, and perhaps not coincidentally, at a time when, depending on the issue, people are being told that if you hold a certain opinion on things, it's not just that we disagree with you, it's that that's not okay of an opinion to have. We just had Kirsten Gillibrand say that about being pro-life if you're a judicial nominee. We've certainly heard folks say that if they're still believe that marriage should only be a man and a woman. We see folks say that if you want to turn folks away who are coming into the country illegally. So where are we as a country right now when folks are not just being told we think your opinions are wrong, but your opinions essentially ought not to even be part of the discussion?
I think it's right out of Orwell's 1984, where the protagonist says, the most important rule is to disobey the evidence of your eyes and ears. It's the final, most essential commandment. And that's a very poignant way of putting it, because when I listen to Gillibrand at the Des Moines Register say, there's such moral clarity that you are racist, in so many words. You're racist if you are pro-life. I saw that thinking to myself, that seems like right out of what Winston said in 1984, that the party, the allegiance to party and to the political, I guess, ideology or program is more important than the truth. And I think that what you're seeing, Greg, is this is now the new reality in our politics, it's so tribal, and the big tech companies have made their choice. They have put their line in the sand with this Pinterest thing. They're saying, we're going to call pro-life people pornography. We exposed it at Project Veritas. YouTube bans our video. Twitter censors our video. And Pinterest, caught between a rock and a hard place, doubles down. They double down. They don't apologize. They say, okay, we're going to take them off the porn list, and then we're going to ban them completely. So they've made their decision. It's a sort of Leninist mentality, a sort of Soviet thinking. We're just going to – allegiance to party is more important than reality, truth, and transparency. And I just hope that the American people wake up, and that is what we're going to try to have happen.
It's certainly becoming harder and harder to ignore, and we'll see what the reaction is, and we'll see if those other whistleblowers come forward as you're suggesting that they might. James, always good to talk to you, sir. Thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg.
James O'Keefe is founder and president of Project Veritas. I'm Greg Corombos, filling in for Tim Donner this week. Still to come, the State of the House Freedom Caucus with former Congressman Dave Brat. And up next, some of the most important freedom-related legal news. Stay tuned.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We're back on Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, news director, Radio America, and co-host of the Three Martini Lunch, sitting in for Tim this week. Tim will be back next week. But happy to be joined now for the next several minutes by Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. Scott, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, let's look at some of the legal headlines that should be getting more headlines this week than probably are. And so often we focus on the negative. So let's start with the positive. And let's start in Texas. This might seem like a small deal, but it's a good step. Texas is legalizing lemonade stands run by kids. The governor there, Greg Abbott, at the end of the legislative session, signing into law a whole bunch of new pieces of legislation, many of which are pro-liberty. Some have dealt with school safety. Some have dealt with human trafficking. Some have allowed the banning of red light cameras in Texas. Others have allowed for the home delivery of beer and wine. But this one allows kids to run lemonade stands without having to get government permits. And so, Scott, how significant is this?
Abbott sounds like a libertarian when you read that list, Greg. That's my first observation. I think this is very important because these sorts of base level things teach kids important lessons about what it means to be an entrepreneur. Literally, go buy some of this stuff and go sell it. And that's sort of the basics of how you can start a business as a 6-year-old in America or a 10-year-old. And I think that it's just crushing when we have to worry about, well, the police may visit and say, you can't do this because of some entrepreneurial sort of city fathers who demand licenses from everybody who tries to make even 10 cents on the sale of lemonade in their jurisdiction.
Who are the scolds here? Is it the cops on patrol? Is it the neighbors, or maybe somebody else who sells lemonade and is worried that they might lose a buck or two?
There seems like a lot to go around, doesn't it? I think it's all those people and people who are unwilling to just say, well, life is full of some give and some take, and let the kids be free. The state here is revoking the towns and cities' permission to regulate this activity. They've said, you haven't been adult enough with these powers we've given you. This power comes from the state, and they farm it out to the locals. And they said, you've abused it in this instance, and we're pulling it back here at least.
Scott, I don't know the history of this. Maybe you do. Back when we were kids, were there actually regulations on the books that nobody bothered to enforce, or was it just a freer time?
Greg, I think it was a question of a discretion, that a police officer, when we were kids, would have been laughed at and mocked if they went ahead and actually proceeded with shutting down the lemonade stand. But that's not how we are today. There's this deference to authority that prevents that natural mocking and scolding, which would have prevented it. So sadly, this is a legislative fix where one wasn't needed in the past, when there was a better sense, I think, of the proper relationship between the state and the people.
Let's move to one that's a little bit more serious and a little bit more imminent, and that's what's going on in St. Louis, Missouri, where a federal judge has essentially demanded changes to the criminal justice system there that can leave people stuck in jail for weeks when they don't have money for bail. And the contention for those who are being held for weeks on end because they don't get a public defender right away, so they languish there before they can get some legal counsel, is that most of them aren't a harm to their communities or a flight risk or anything like that. So on the one hand, you want to be tough on law and order, and you want there to be repercussions for crime. On the other hand, of course, you want criminals to have the rights that the Constitution guarantees them. So what do you make of this one?
I thought it was fascinating, Greg, that St. Louis did not take into account people's ability to pay when they set bail. The entire reason for bail is to guarantee that the person will show up to have their charges heard in a proper, in court. You've been charged with a crime. You have to come back and face those charges. Well, in order to secure your presence at the later hearing, the court takes bail. Well, all that matters is the ability to pay. A $1,000 bail set for somebody who's worth $1 million is not a sufficient enough hook to get them to come back. And a $1,000 bail for somebody who makes $15,000 a year is too much money, for relatively minor charges. So it was that I think Judge Audrey Fleissig of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri really drove her to the point where saying these accused federal civil rights were not being respected by the court in St. Louis, because it just simply ran roughshod over those rights and locked up all these poor people regardless.
Is this an issue in many cities and other locations around the country, or is St. Louis unique in some way?
I think that the issue of excessive bail is present in so many cities. We often see this, Greg, in Democrat stronghold big cities in America. that's where so many of the push comes. But I haven't seen where they literally don't take into account at all somebody's ability to pay. So I think that's probably why St. Louis was ordered to change their ways here. I think it's important to remember when these people who can't pay their bail, they will lose their jobs, they'll lose apartments, all the commitments they have in life that they're meeting, oftentimes will go by the wayside. So it's a profound experience for so many of the people who are actually caught up in it and their families. So not to be taken lightly.
Let's move to a different part of law enforcement and to a different part of the country. Let's head out to San Francisco, where there's a lawsuit out there now where 13 present and former San Francisco police officers are suing the city in federal court Tuesday, claiming that they have been discriminated against in promotions because they're white. 12 plaintiffs are current officers who allege they were passed over for promotions to sergeant, lieutenant, or captain because they are white males. The other plaintiff is a retired sergeant who contends she was passed over for promotion to lieutenant because she's a white lesbian. The issue here, claiming that the city uses an obscure and biased promotional process that makes it possible for officers who score lower on examinations to be promoted over higher scoring candidates. It's known as a banding system. So obviously, who knows whether this is actually happening, but how hard is this to prove, Scott?
It's not hard to prove that they use this particular system, this banding system that you mentioned. The question is now, in the wake of the termination of the consent decree that they had previously operated under, is that a legal system? So, Greg, the problem here is that so many municipalities discriminated against illegally and massively so against minorities, especially blacks, earlier in their history. And unfortunately, what they've done to try to reverse that now is discriminate against whites. And the proper course here, of course, is to not take race into account to the extent it's removable in any hiring decision in a municipal government capacity.
Where does this go? I mean, when you're in San Francisco, it's obviously one of the most PC areas of the country. Is this lawsuit going to be heard with any sort of seriousness out there, do you think?
Do you think maybe there's a high degree of pressure to see a lot of diversity in the upper levels of the police force by the people in San Francisco? Yeah, you're right about that. And I actually think that makes it more likely that we will see a big award come out of this, because it seems like, I don't want to prejudge these people's liability, Greg, but it seems like it's almost impossible that the city fathers would say, although that comment itself is probably impermissible, the city parents would not massively pressure those to discriminate against whites because they are now out of favor. It's disfavorable to have white males at the top of the organizational chain. It's women of color or non-binaries that are, the gold standard now.
Well, I don't know exactly what goes into the examinations, but based on what we're hearing out of San Francisco, the officers on the beat who can keep the needles and the human waste off the street ought to be at the top of the list for promotions. Scott, always good to have your insights on these cases, cases that deserve a whole lot more attention than they often get, but we're glad to profile them here on Liberty Nation. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Greg.
Scott Cosenza is legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. I'm Greg Caucus in for Tim Donner. When we come back, the State of the House Freedom Caucus with former Virginia Congressman Dave Brat. Stay with us.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And we're back on Liberty Nation. This is the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Caucus of Radio America and the Three Martini Lunch, sitting in for Tim this week. My guest at this time is Dave Brat. He served as a congressman from Virginia's 7th Congressional District for a couple of terms, and he is now the dean of the business school at Liberty University. We want to get his insights onto the first few months of the new Congress, and also what is the role of the Freedom Caucus, which Mr. Brat was a prominent member of, now that the GOP is in the minority in the House of Representatives. And Dave, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Greg, great to be on. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you're enjoying the private sector as much as you enjoyed serving your constituents up on Capitol Hill. But let's talk about the role of the Freedom Caucus here. It's been in the news the last couple of days because Justin Amash, who is another prominent member, publicly called for an impeachment inquiry into the president and was rebuked in a way by the caucus, and now he's resigned from it. So particularly now with Republicans not calling the shots in the House, what do you see as the role of the Freedom Caucus right now?
Yeah, well, I think the Freedom Caucus stands for conserving and constructing all the things that made this country great. And that, unfortunately, that's not in right now, right? Policy in terms of the left is deconstructing the Judeo-Christian tradition. They're deconstructing the rule of law, and they're deconstructing capitalism and free markets. And so the role of the Freedom Caucus is just to stand in the gap there. And unfortunately, we're in the minority, but all of those folks believe in those principles. And so we need to do better at the ballot box and get the word out. The left is just at war in terms of politics. They go straight to character assassination and those kind of things to win elections. And conservatives in our leadership needs to do a better job of framing the issues at the national level. Last cycle, the health care issue was huge, and we had pre-existing conditions covered in our bill, but our leadership didn't put that out enough. And so we need to do a better job, even when you're in the minority, of telling the American people how much good policy matters. And the left right now is just way off target, and I think the American people are finally starting to see that. And so I feel optimistic coming up. You know, the debt and deficits and the economic growth right now is super, and it's never covered. The unemployment rate is so low that just across the board, we have good news. We're hitting on all cylinders, and a lot of that's due to the Trump tax cuts. And so that's all great news, but we need to trumpet that daily. And I'm working at Liberty in the business school. And, of course, we believe in all three of those pillars that made the country great: the Judeo-Christian tradition, the rule of law, uplifting the police officers, sheriffs, everybody, first servers, responders. And then the free market system is under attack. And it's just amazing that when China is moving toward freedom and the U.S. is actually contemplating socialism, and it's on the front page of the papers. And so I don't get what the hang-up is, but the voter has to eventually come back our way, I would think.
What do you make of criticism, to some extent from the right, but obviously much of it from the left and maybe even the middle, that the Republicans and to some extent even the Freedom Caucus, given the rebuke of Justin Amash, has been less about principle lately and more about simply defending the president?
I don't buy that. My own time in Congress, I stood firm on the principles and policy and ran on that. And unfortunately, when the left goes after, they just bring up, race and gender and the hatred and all that kind of thing. And the press knows it's not true either, right? We all get along. The Republicans, Democrats get along personally. We work out in the weight room in the mornings. We all get along. But the press is just overwhelmingly left. And they hit conservative. You just go look at the usual. You have Politico and Roll Call and The Hill and all the tabloids. They never give any credit to the conservative side for anything. And so part of it's just messaging. Conservatives have to do a better job of messaging and putting in place the institutions, right? The left has taken over all the institutions, right? K-12, higher education, the media, all the mainstream media is owned by the left. And the money was raining down from heaven the last cycle on the left. They have the energy, but we can turn that around. We have to do a better job on the messaging.
Speaking of the messaging, what do you make of the public messaging? And you said obviously it could be improved, but the public messaging thus far of the House leadership. It's an interesting position they find themselves in now because the president, of course, is a member of their own party, and he obviously takes up a lot of the oxygen when it comes to GOP messaging, and the Republicans also control the Senate. So it seems like Kevin McCarthy's been quieter than previous Republican leaders when they've been in the minority. But historically, those Republican leaders in the minority have been pretty vocal about, well, if we had the power, we would be doing this. And they seem generally more strident than when they actually have the power. So what do you make of McCarthy and his team so far?
Well, that's right. I mean, I'm waiting to see a new, contract with America, Newt Gingrich, et cetera, that kind of formulation of exactly what are we going to push when we get there. When you say you're going to repeal Obamacare, and then when you're put in power, you have to do that. That's 1/5 of the economy is just bureaucratically being run by D.C. And we have a winning message, right? I mean, it's very interesting. The left, Bernie Sanders, all the way through Trump. The American people know D.C. has been captured by the money and special interests, and yet the American people don't see that most of the money now is on the left. And even big business, right, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, is just protecting narrow business interests. They're not protecting free markets. And so a lot of the big business folks say, yeah, I'm in favor of big, free markets in general, but they're not in favor of free markets when it comes to their own business. And we have to have the courage and the backbone to live out our creed, because it is good for the world, right? China is growing like crazy as they move toward freedom on the economic side. They're not moving toward freedom on the political side. And the president is right, because if we don't check them and make them play by the rules, since World War II, right, we set up the Bretton Woods, the liberal order. Liberals should be in favor of this, right, where you have free trade, and President Trump has said he's in favor of getting rid of all tariffs if the rest of the world will do that. And so he set out some good markers that will produce massive growth, et cetera, but the left has no interest in that. They have very narrow special interests that favor them, and they say yes to everything. And so you haven't heard a word about deficits or debt or anything from the press, because the left is all the presidential candidates on the left, right, the 20 of them, they're all proposing $1 trillion plus proposals across the board on clean environment, et cetera. And some of them are up in the 30 trillion to 100 trillion proposals, Elizabeth Warren, et cetera. And those numbers are so big, I don't think the American people actually think that that it's credible. And we need to show it's not credible. You cannot do that. You will sink the machine, and you'll slow down the engine that is producing all the jobs right now. And the kids, I'm at Liberty University, dean of the business school, and the job front right now is great. The prospects are great for our students and alums, et cetera. The economy is kicking in on all cylinders, and we want to keep it that way.
As I mentioned, and you just mentioned again, you're the dean of the business school at Liberty University, so you're around these kids all the time, and I'm guessing the demographics of Liberty are a little more to the right than the typical young people of that age, which generally trend to the left. And so the question is, what do they want to hear? Whether, regardless of their political persuasion, what do they want to hear from their leaders in terms of addressing what matters to them? This is a massive rising generation, and you've got two guys in their 70s who are likely to be facing each other for president of the United States next year, leading a lot of people to wonder whether they're paying attention to what matters to that generation. They're going to differ on what the solutions are, but when you talk to these kids, what are they most concerned about?
Well, I think the younger generation, they get along with their parents now. It's a good new day. Our kids are very ethical, and they want to construct and keep the things that made America great, but they're looking for authenticity. And they want to see that if you believe something, that's why a lot of the left is attracted to Bernie, right? That a lot of the young kids go that route because he's internally consistent. The problem is externally, socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried. And so he's consistent and authentic to socialism in a big state. And the left and the press is all concerned with fascism all the time. Fascism requires a big state. And so the conservatives and the freedom types like me, we want a small state. We want businesses to thrive. And the bigger the state gets, the worse businesses do, right? India and China are the success story of the last 20, 30 years. They've brought 2 billion people, right? They've 7 billion people on the planet. 2 billion people have come out of poverty due to free markets. And we need to trumpet that. So the left is always making a moral case and an ethical case when we have all the evidence on the moral and ethical side. We have made life better for 2 billion people, all children of God. And I'm extremely proud of that, but I don't think the word is getting out. So it's all messaging. We got to get the money to win races again, and then we've got a message on our message is a total winner.
Dave, always great to talk with you, sir. Thanks for walking us through how you see the current state of affairs up on Capitol Hill and beyond, and we look forward to talking to you again down the road.
Greg, great to be on. Thank you very much.
Dave Brat is a former Virginia congressman and a former member of the House Freedom Caucus. He is now the dean of the business school at Liberty University. I'm Greg COROMBOS, news director at Radio America and co-host of the 3 Martini Lunch podcast. It's been a thrill to sit in for Tim this week. We want to let you know if you're interested in the 3 Martini Lunch podcast, we're found at iTunes and wherever else podcasts can be found. You can also find us at ricochet.com. Tim Donner will be back next week behind this microphone, but until then, stand up for liberty.